As a deeply pretentious young man, I was obsessed with late Victoriana. The gaslit streets of Conan Doyle's London, the decadent world of Oscar Wilde. And the shockingly beautiful and beautifully shocking artworks of Aubrey Beardsley, a young artist who wielded outrage and self-promotion as adroitly as his pen, and whose uncompromising attitude feels utterly modern.
A 23-year-old boy doing those in the Victorian era is astounding. They're still kind of, whoa!
The critics were complaining about Mr. Beardsley's disgusting woman really plumbed new depths of horror and depravity.
But I was also drawn to his romantically brief life, dead at 25, an artistic career of just 6 years, cut short by tuberculosis.
He knew he didn't have long. He consciously worked faster. He was aware that if he had his life's work to do, he had to do it quickly.
Who could resist a story like this? The modern cult of Beardsley began here at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where, in May 1966, the first major retrospective of his work caused a sensation.
But what isn't so well known is that after that landmark exhibition opened here, the Vice Squad raided a nearby bookshop after complaints that it was selling copies of Beardsley's risque Salome drawings for $1 a pop. But when quizzed by the coppers, the bookseller replied that he could see nothing wrong with it, as the originals were on display up the road. The police then came here to the V&A to interview the director, Sir Trenchard Cox, who assured them, over a cup of tea, that Beardsley was art and not pornography. The police went quietly on their way.
Many of Beardsley's most explicit drawings were indeed on show, but a few were held back. And now I've come to take a peek at one of them. This is The Impatient Adulterer, one of a series of drawings made by Beardsley to illustrate the satires of the Roman poet Juvenal. Beardsley considered it rather a nice picture, but the curator of the 1966 show deemed it too nasty to exhibit. This was clearly too much for a swinging 60s audience, and perhaps it's still too much for us now. It's a question that Beardsley's work continues to pose. From decadent London to the tranquil south of France, I'm going to follow in Beardsley's fevered footsteps to explore the world of an artist every bit as strange, perverse, and elusive as his art.
I want to find out how, against such disabling odds, this extraordinary young man achieved so much in so short a time.
Where better to begin than with Aubrey Beardsley's first great work, created when he was just 19. It's a scene from Act 2 of Siegfried by Richard Wagner, Beardsley's favorite composer. It's an extraordinary piece of work. What we start to expect from Beardsley is great passages of negative space, particularly white, but it's also densely packed with detail. And although it's a sort of bucolic landscape, it's also completely occupied by sort of monstrous flowers. There's something, as ever with Beardsley, unhealthy about it, which I find very appealing. Beardsley himself must have been hugely proud of this picture, because he presented it as a gift to Edward Burne-Jones, the artist who had perhaps inspired him more than any other as he was growing up. Young Aubrey's first significant encounter with the work of Burne-Jones was here, at the Church of the Annunciation in Brighton, the town where Beardsley was born in 1872. Beardsley was very drawn to this stained glass window here above the high altar. It depicts the Annunciation and attendant angels, and it was designed by Burne-Jones and executed by William Morris, two of the leading English artists of the day. And I can see how these willowy, androgynous figures influenced Beardsley's own early work. Gazing up at it in wonder, little could Beardsley have known that within a few years, Burne-Jones would affect the course of his artistic career. But I think there's a deeper reason for Beardsley's visits here. Soon after his 7th birthday, he fell ill with a fever and persistent cough. The doctor, fearing the worst, detected an ominous creaking on the lungs. It was tuberculosis. TB, or consumption, was the great killer of late Victorian England. There was no known cure, but often death came only after many years of severe coughing, weight loss, and hemorrhages. The young priest in charge of the church, Father Chapman, was also tubercular. Aubrey became deeply impressed by the zeal with which Chapman pursued his vocation in the face of disease.
Thanks be to God.
With the knowledge that he was then deemed incurable, Beardsley, I think, decided he would have to live his life with, as a friend put it, the fatal speed of those who are to die young. At school in Brighton, Aubrey was too frail for sport and games, but his talent for drawing was soon recognized by his housemaster, who encouraged an interest in French art and literature. Beardsley would continue to look overseas for inspiration as his artistic skills developed. But Aubrey had barely left school when his tuberculosis erupted in a sudden attack.
When he was 17 and had his first major hemorrhage coughing up blood, it would have been clear that he had the adult form of tuberculosis and he could expect to probably die quite young. Now, if you look at Victorian representations of consumption in particular, they're very focused on the deathbed and the sickbed, as if consumptives are essentially dying people. But you can imagine how unhelpful that is for someone who is living with this disease. How do you build a life for yourself when your culture doesn't have a sense of what that life would look like?
The shock of his hemorrhage transformed Beardsley into a young man in a hurry. He now sought out every opportunity to further his artistic development. By this time, he was living with his mother and sister in London, where he worked as a junior clerk at the Guardian Life Assurance Company. It was office drudgery by day, incessant drawing by night. Weekends saw Beardsley and his sister Mabel voraciously binging on their favorite paintings by artists like Burne-Jones, scouring museums, galleries, and even collections in private homes.
In July 1891, just before Beardsley turned 19, there was a bit of an artistic epiphany for him. He visited the house of Frederick Leyland with his sister, Mabel, and Leyland's house probably had one of the most important collection of contemporary artists. And here is a copy of a letter that Beardsley wrote to a school friend recounting this visit to Leyland's house. And that shows Beardsley with his sister Mabel entering this house. So it's going through the rooms with Leyland's employees standing there very stiffly.
Gorgeous. It's very evocative drawing there.
It is, yes. It looks a little bit scruffy, but already has the cane of the dandies. He listed all the paintings that he saw and put exclamation marks on what he liked. And one of the pictures that he liked was Proserpine by Rossetti. Beardsley's imagination was really fired up, I think, by what he saw, and he does quite a few drawings with Rossetti femme fatale types, but always in a more subversive way. Burne-Jones was probably one of the artists who fascinated Beardsley the most at the time. I think he was particularly interested in mythology in Burne-Jones's works, but also in the drapery, the ethereal quality of his paintings, this sort of idea that you have a world of imagination. And the compositions as well. The elongated vertical format is something that is also going to inspire Beardsley.
But Beardsley didn't just seek out paintings. He shrewdly sought out the painters themselves. Edward Burne-Jones had begun opening his London studio to the public. And so one Sunday afternoon, the 18-year-old Beardsley went to call on the man he considered the greatest living artist in Europe.
However, at the door they were told the studio was closed and no one would be admitted without a special appointment.
They began to walk away when a voice called out after them,
"Pray, come back. I couldn't think of letting you go away without seeing the pictures."
It was Burne-Jones himself, who then ushered them in and proceeded to give Beardsley and his sister a private tour of his studio.
In an incredibly audacious move, and one that must have been premeditated, Beardsley then mentioned that he just happened, by the merest chance, to have some of his drawings with him, contained in a small leather portfolio. Burne-Jones began to look through them before delivering a verdict that was to change Beardsley's life. All are full of thought and poetry and imagination, he observed. Nature has given you every gift necessary to become a great artist. I seldom or never advise anyone to take up art as a profession, but in your case, I can do nothing else.
And that's how Beardsley presented Burne-Jones with this, the largest and most intricately worked of his early pen drawings. He was rightly flattered when Burne-Jones hung it in pride of place in his drawing room. But as well as being a gift, the picture now strikes me as a declaration of arrival, which I'm coming to see as characteristic of Beardsley's remarkable sense of confidence.
But we also see the beginning of the Beardsley brand, because here is one of the first, if not the first, instances of the famous Beardsley trademark, as he called it, the three-pronged signature.
But Siegfried also marked the end of Beardsley's early period. He was rapidly moving away from the influence of the Pre-Raphaelites to head in an even more striking and original direction. In the weeks following his encounter with Burne-Jones, Beardsley settled into a very specific creative routine. After finishing his day's work, he'd return to the family lodgings here at 59 Charlwood Street, Pimlico. At a small plain table, Beardsley would set out 2 French ormolu candlesticks, a sheaf of medium-grade cartridge paper, pen, and ink. And thereafter, often into the small hours, he'd lose himself to a gallery of strange new creations, which seemed to startle even Beardsley himself. I struck for myself an entirely new method of drawing and composition. The subjects were quite mad and a little indecent. Strange hermaphroditic creatures wandering about in Pierrot costumes or modern dress, quite a new world of my imagination. These pictures strike me as graphic in both senses of the word. They're explicit, and they also have a clarity and simplicity of line. They reflect a dramatic new influence on Beardsley's work: Japanese art. On his visit to the Leyland house that summer, Beardsley had a revelation when he was shown into the Peacock Room, symbolic of a widespread Japanese craze during the late Victorian period, following the opening of trade links with the East. His interest piqued, Beardsley began to seek out examples of Shunga woodblock prints. He was beguiled not just by their fine lines and flat tones, but also by their erotic and nightmarish aura.
This is a book that we know from a school friend of Beardsley's that he knew well, and it's called Tales from Old Japan. And you can see echoes here, sort of quite clearly, of these Japanese folk tales.
Yes, it's an immediate, obvious influence, but the use of the negative space, the black and white, but then the grotesquerie, but he's immediately synthesized it into his own Beardsley vision, hasn't he?
And wouldn't have been seen in quite this way, I think, until the Japanese sort of influence started to come in. It's something...
This aspect of Beardsley's work has long been a source of inspiration for Chris Riddell, one of today's most imaginative book illustrators.
I think what's special about Beardsley is his idiosyncrasy. If you see a Beardsley, you never forget it. And I think maybe that's because he's so effective in channeling his influences and making them his own. And I remember being very struck by his characterization, the simplicity of his line. Figures sort of bleed off the page and sort of spreads almost like a stain to the edges of the picture plane. No one composes pictures quite like Beardsley.
So this has always been one of my favourites, Incipit Vita Nova, Here Begins the New Life. Where do you think this rather angry fetus motif comes from?
That's fascinating, isn't it? I think this is his step into a new visual language. I like to think of this illustration as a farewell to Burne-Jones and the pre-Raphaelite profile. There's something curdled about the
shadow.
Oh, yes. And the fetus, I mean, it's interesting. This is a German book of anatomy that Beardsley would have encountered in his grandfather's study. And you can see here these diagrams of a fetus we recognise. What he's added, I think, is this sort of notion of absolute sort of implacable fury. This appears just at the time when Beardsley himself is making a transition into a new style.
He begins a new life, so
absolutely.
He's talking about himself.
And then the fetus recurs, so he obviously you know, enjoyed using this as a device.
This amazing picture of a birth from the calf of a leg. What on earth is going on there?
And we can see here a wonderful sort of Beardsley composition. This has got a very Japanese quality to it, and yet it is all Beardsley's own.
It's a blood spatter pattern. It's like a crime scene. That's what he's...
Yes, yes. And then with sort of areas of rather exquisite beauty in the detail of the flowers. And then you get this extraordinary detail, which is the sort of scissors, the sort of almost medical instrument pointing up towards the mother, which is sort of, again, a little sinister detail. And Beardsley's very good, I think, at just throwing us off kilter. By all accounts, he worked very quickly in some senses in terms of laying down the ink, but was very decisive. And so he must have had great sort of hand-eye coordination and a very steady hand, I think, when applying the sort of black ink, and almost with no correction, which I think is remarkable.
Beardsley's bold new style was matched by an increasing commercial ambition. Although he was beginning to sell his works privately for between 5 and 10 shillings a drawing, Beardsley decided it was time to besiege the publishers, as he put it, in order to reach a bigger market. Once again, Beardsley showed remarkable savvy for someone who was still just 19. He was, in today's parlance, excellent at networking. And his big break was just around the corner. Frederick Evans, the proprietor of Beardsley's favourite bookshop, had heard that the publisher J.M. Dent was seeking an illustrator for an edition of Sir Thomas Malory's chivalric romance, The Morte d'Arthur. One day, Evans urged Dent to come along to the bookshop to see some examples of Beardsley's work. And as they looked through them, who should walk in but Beardsley himself on his lunchtime browse? Evans pointed him out. "There's your man," he said. Dent found Beardsley weird and emaciated, but sensed, as he wrote later, a new breath of life in English black and white drawing, and he asked Beardsley to provide a specimen illustration for his approval. Rightly sensing that angry fetuses might not be quite what Dent was looking for, Beardsley switched back to his earlier style. Over the next few days, he worked tirelessly on a drawing depicting the climax of the Morte d'Arthur, the achieving of the Sangreal. And then he held his breath. Any reservations Dent might have had vanished the moment he saw the picture. He declared it a masterpiece and commissioned Beardsley at once. Beardsley immediately handed in his resignation at the Guardian Life Insurance Office. That was that. He was an artist, and from now on he was determined to live by his pen. The sheer scale of the commission was daunting, but rather than forcing Beardsley to take a stylistic step back, the Morte d'Arthur would actually capture his continuing artistic evolution. I've come to look at a rare original copy with one of the world's leading Beardsley scholars.
Hello.
Hello.
Come in.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mark, what we've got here are the Morte d'Arthur, the 2 volumes. He was asked to make over 400 designs for this book, all the way through. It has an amazing array of full pages, borders, chapter headings. It's a staggering piece of work for basically an untried artist.
It's absolutely stunning, isn't it?
Probably one of the most elaborate illustrations in the whole book was used as the frontispiece, and it shows King Arthur having encountered the dragon that he's laying rather nonchalantly in front of. But you can see that in this, Beardsley has crammed as much complicated detail as he possibly can.
It's a statement of intent, isn't it, I think, in a way. There couldn't be anything more clean-limbed and wholesome than the story of Arthur and the Grail.
All the way through, he starts introducing odd characters that are nothing to do with Malory and the Knights and Middle Ages. He starts putting Pan and fauns in. Quite funny, but deeply subversive.
The pagan in the most Christian of texts.
Exactly. And I suspect half the time, he's just actually introducing elements almost for the fun of it, almost to be confusing. I think Dent, the publisher, was delighted because people talked about the book.
That's all that matters.
It's what matters. And you can see in the early stages, they're incredibly elaborate. He's really throwing his all into it. By the time he's getting on through the book, he's actually having to do 6 or 10 drawings in a night in order to keep up with the deadline. And he finds ways, in fact, of actually putting slightly less intricate effort into it. And he begins to sort of interest in a sort of simplified pen technique even, which obviously allowed him to fulfil the commission.
This is one of my favourites. I remember this very well from my teenage years, Guinevere becoming a nun. But what I always loved is just this incredible stark blackness.
Yeah, this is what he called his black blot. Your eye invents all the detail.
Yeah. There's a sort of flatness to them, isn't there?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, like Japanese prints that have no shadows, no perspective.
And this also coincides with something of a revolution in the printing process.
Absolutely. I can show you. Here's an old-fashioned wood-engraved block, just a block of boxwood. An artist will have made a design, and then a different man, a craftsman, will have sat patiently carving away at the block.
So the old way of reproducing is essentially a copy of a copy. Someone else's hand is interpreting the artist's work.
Absolutely. Beardsley exploited this extraordinary new technique called zinc line blocks. So basically, the original drawing is photographed and induced onto a zinc plate. This is the new cutting-edge technology. This could be done quickly and cheaply. But more importantly for Beardsley, what you see here is Beardsley's exact line. It's not interpreted by a wood engraver. And Beardsley's whole career is actually predicated on the fact that this new process allows his drawings to be rapidly reproduced.
At just 20, Beardsley had become a new, very modern kind of artist. The printing technique created a direct connection between Beardsley and his audience. The illustrations you held in your hand weren't copies of originals hanging in galleries or private collections, but the finished artwork itself. But the Morte d'Arthur hadn't even been published when, with characteristic urgency, Beardsley made his next move. He was bewitched by London's avant-garde, the circle of decadents and aesthetes of whom Oscar Wilde was the acknowledged king. With his frail body and fevered imaginings, Beardsley must have thought he would find kindred spirits here. And in early 1893, he saw a way in to this exclusive group. A new magazine called The Studio was taking shape. Its publishers wanted it to reflect the latest artistic trends and were looking for a new face to give them a sensational send-off. Beardsley was the perfect choice. One never forgets one's first review. Success to Scandal, Times Educational Supplement, 1988. For Beardsley, it was this. As well as designing this striking cover, the publishers chose no less than 7 of Beardsley's drawings to accompany their keynote article, A New Illustrator, Aubrey Beardsley. The article celebrated the presence among us of an artist whose work is quite as remarkable in its execution as in its invention. It sealed Beardsley's reputation overnight. And it provided him with the springboard to seize the commission of a lifetime. He'd been tipped off that an illustrated version of Oscar Wilde's banned biblical play Salome was to be published. Beardsley knew he had the credentials to make an unsolicited pitch. With canny acumen, remember, he was still only 20 years old, he made this drawing. Beardsley employed all his most Japonesque conventions in depicting the climax of Wilde's play, where Salome kisses the severed head of John the Baptist. Would Wilde see it? Would he like it? Would he take the bait? But of course he did. Beardsley's drawing had cast its spell. Salome was his. By August 1893, Aubrey Beardsley had more than just his 21st birthday to celebrate. Wilde's ringing endorsement proved to be his passport to fame. Beardsley became a regular sight on the giddy social circuit. New friends, including the artists Max Beerbohm, William Rothenstein, and Walter Sickert, captured his pale, attenuated figure, immaculately attired, thanks to his £50 fee from Salome's publisher, John Lane. Throwing himself into the commission with what he called a mystico-oriental style, Beardsley conjured some of the defining images of the decade.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? And it takes me straight back to my sort of, I don't know, when I was 12 or something, and I first saw these images, and I would stare at that face and think it's smiling, but it's so cruel.
Yes.
You know, and that one as well. They're demonic.
It's just amazing tracery of delicate lines and all these weird, unhealthy blooms.
Yes. There's so much to look at. Even though it's simple and clear and clean, there's actually a lot. Every candle has a little story. There's a little phallic symbol underneath it, and another little creature holding up that one.
Well, the fascinating thing is this is the censored version.
Oh, you're joking.
This is the original.
Oh, you're right.
Here.
Even with pubic hair, which, as we know, the Victorians really didn't like at all. Goodness me.
And our old friend the fetus making a return.
Yes.
Beardsley completely ignoring the diktats of the text.
Within his drawings for Salome, Beardsley introduces the unmistakable figure of Oscar Wilde himself. And yet, there seems to be a very fine line between homage and ridicule.
So this is The Woman in the Moon, and we have a very clear
Oscar, yeah.
Oscar here. John Lane, the publisher, took fright at it being called The Man in the Moon in case there was a sort of litigious dimension.
Oh, yes.
Changed the title to The Woman in the Moon. But then I remember thinking when I saw that as a teenager that as a caricature of Wilde, it's even crueler calling it that because it appears to be a sort of blousy lady. Sort of
yes.
Very fleshy-faced.
It is a peculiar thing that he would do to someone who's older and more, greater than he at the time. Most people would say, this is the great Oscar Wilde, and he thought that himself. And he would presume to do that.
He sort of has a sort of crush or some kind of hero worship. Very rapidly, he turns it into a satire or
bites the hand.
Bites the hand, yeah.
Bites the hand.
We sometimes forget how young he was. What he actually has is all the pretentiousness of a man of 21 and all the ingratitude.
Yes.
Whether or not Wilde took offense from Beardsley's parody, he also seems to have taken inspiration from him.
Wilde was influenced by Beardsley to the extent that he saw in Beardsley someone with an absolutely cold eye, the absolute eye of an artist who refused to be sentimental. And if you look at Wilde's work after Salome, he learnt in meeting Beardsley that you could get rid of every element that appears kindly. So, for example, Lady Windermere's Fan has melodrama and sentimentality in it. But after Beardsley, he writes The Importance of Being Earnest, which is crystalline in its absolute perfection and has no hint of melodrama and no hint of sentimentality. In that sense, it's much closer to Beardsley than what he'd been doing before. And maybe he saw in this young man, he thought, you can go that far.
There's a wonderful quote. A friend catches him scurrying through London in the winter without a coat. He says, I don't need one, I am always burning. And I think it means both physically and artistically. He's on fire.
Salome caused precisely the sensation Beardsley had anticipated. His scandalous drawings easily upstaging Wilde's text and forcing a wedge between them. But Beardsley, never one to play safe, was already plotting his next move. As 1894 dawned, he hurried round to the offices of the Bodley Head to see his publisher, John Lane.
Beardsley proposed a radical idea, a bold new quarterly magazine in which all that was daring in art and literature could appear, and with a clear demarcation between the two, pictures independent of stories and stories independent of pictures. He even proposed a title, The Yellow Book, knowing it would call to mind the popular and illicit French novels of the day, bound in yellow wrappers.
Seeing the potential this illicit glare of yellow might have, Lane agreed to back the venture at once, with Beardsley serving as art editor. But Beardsley had one stipulation.
Perhaps fearing that Wilde would dominate the new venture, Beardsley insisted that Wilde be kept out of the Yellow Book.
His confidence that he no longer needed Wilde was vindicated by the Yellow Book's instant success, selling out its first run of 5,000 copies in under a week. The tape holds some of the original designs that Beardsley produced for his new magazine.
This is Beardsley's drawing for the very first number of the Yellow Book. These masked revelers have more than a hint of Toulouse-Lautrec's Moulin Rouge, but in Beardsley's hands they become by turns erotic and sinister. This cat-like figure here with his or her sensual lips and almost drugged expression seems replete with possibilities, not all of them benign. This picture, known simply as the Fat Woman, was also intended for the first number of the Yellow Book. I love its bold composition. The hair, the hat, the feather are almost abstract shapes. And then the stark simplicity of this black wine bottle against the great expanse of white tablecloth.
Looking back through editions of the Yellow Book, I'm surprised by just how many of Beardsley's drawings were of female figures. Was he, I wonder, identifying with another group of late Victorian troublemakers?
I think what Beardsley was doing with inventing this kind of Beardsley woman was he was taking fears that existed at the time about the what was called the New Woman, which was a new generation of women who were beginning to demand a lot of the freedoms that their brothers took for granted. So they were riding bicycles, they were taking jobs, so they had some financial, that sort of thing. They had a little bit of financial independence. They had latchkeys, they smoked cigarettes and read racy novels. And of course, all this provoked a moral panic at the time with people who really thought, oh my goodness, where will this end? Of course, they were sort of proto-feminists. So Beardsley took what was actually a type at the time, and he realised what anxiety it was provoking. He gave it a little twist and made her a little bit more sinister. But I think that his creation of this extraordinary female figure was much more about him finding a way of expressing himself. For me, I think Beardsley is interested in transgression, whether that transgression is a woman out at night by herself choosing her own book, or whether it's something much more extreme. But it all came to a bit of a head with Volume 3 of the Yellow Book, which shows a woman looking at her reflection in a looking glass, and she's putting her makeup on. This provoked a critic from The World to refer to Mr. Beardsley's disgusting woman, and another critic said that it really plumbed new depths of horror and depravity. But there is a theory that because her dressing table mirror is lit by these two lamps here, which are little replicas of street lamps.
Street lamps, yes.
So the idea, well, as a girl, I was always told to put my makeup on by the light I would appear in. So if you're going to be appearing during the day, you put it on by daylight. So the idea that she's putting it on by the light of street lamps can only mean that she was planning to spend her evening walking the streets.
That's quite a subtle code. They got it.
Yes.
I was taught the same thing, though.
Beardsley took fiendish delight in the attacks on the Yellow Book. "Have you heard of the storm that raged?" he wrote to the novelist Henry James. "Most of the thunderbolts fell on my head. However, I enjoyed the excitement immensely." As a mark of celebrity status, you couldn't beat the pages of Punch magazine, which now took delight in lampooning Beardsley's drawings, like this one, with their own spoof versions, signed with names like Aubrey Beardsley and Aubrey Beardsley. Ever ready to embrace new trends and reach as wide an audience as possible, Beardsley now fixed his antennae on a rapidly developing new medium that he realised would introduce him to the man in the street.
On his infrequent visits to Paris, Beardsley had noticed how French poster design by the likes of Toulouse-Lautrec and others had transformed the streets into veritable open-air galleries, and now he hoped to create a similar splash of colour on the streets of London.
Advertisement, pronounced Beardsley, is an absolute necessity of modern life. Could he be referring to himself?
Beardsley's posters startled pedestrians, and like his illustrations, divided the critics, which I think would have delighted him. Here, I think he continues to suggest the independent, liberated woman of the 1890s, and yet, no matter what the product, they're still teasingly sensual. This one, believe it or not, is advertising children's books. And this one, tempting the pedestrian through a beaded curtain, was said by one reviewer to cause cab horses to shy at the sight of her.
Throughout 1894, Beardsley seemed unstoppable. Then, in early November, a sudden hemorrhage signaled the grim recurrence of tuberculosis. It was a severe attack, quite possibly exacerbated by his heavy workload. Doctors ordered his immediate removal to a clinic in the countryside. And it wasn't until early in the new year that Beardsley felt well enough to properly pick up his pen again, only for a very different crisis to erupt. The arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel on the 5th of April 1895 for acts of gross indecency burst the decadent bubble forever. Beardsley was swiftly and quite unfairly caught up in the scandal. Leaving the hotel in the company of two detectives, Wilde was seen to be holding a French novel bound in yellow wrappers.
Believing it to be the Yellow Book, people rapidly took matters into their own hands. A crowd assembled here on Vigo Street, outside the offices of the Bodley Head, and began to pelt these windows with mud and cobblestones. It was an attack on decadent art and all that was deemed immoral. It was clear from the actions of the angry mob out here, a passable little riot, as one commentator called it, that Wilde's polluting influence was seen to spread like a disease through the pages of the Yellow Book and by association through Beardsley himself. Almost overnight, he seemed to face an uncertain future.
Wilde's imprisonment in May 1895 sent shockwaves through artistic London. One critic accused Beardsley of being sexless and unclean. Beardsley had just finished designing this cover for Volume 5 of the Yellow Book when he learned that his publisher, John Lane, had fired him. He'd finally been living the life of his fantasies, only to be brutally woken up. His career was now quite likely over. But you don't get to achieve all that Aubrey Beardsley had done by knowing when to give up. It's said that as the Wilde scandal exploded, 600 gentlemen took the boat train to France. Many were destined for Dieppe, then something of an artist's colony. There, Beardsley and his fellow aesthetes recovered and regrouped. They responded to their recent tribulations with a fresh wave of creativity. And before long, Beardsley was invited to set up a new magazine.
Beardsley seized on the plan. Here was a chance to reverse his fortunes and also perhaps to showcase a new style in his drawing. Across a cafe table, he devised the magazine's manifesto, hoping to appeal to the tastes of the intelligent. Beardsley even came up with a name, the Savoy, like the recently opened hotel, something lavish and modern.
All well and good, but Beardsley needed a new publisher. Enter Leonard Smithers, an enterprising but somewhat disreputable figure whose proud boast was that he would publish anything the others were afraid to touch. A sign in his bookshop window proclaimed, "Smut is cheap today." Beardsley had lost none of his desire to provoke and burn bridges. His original cover for the first issue of the Savoy depicted a cherub vengefully urinating on a copy of the Yellow Book. Even Smithers insisted it was changed. In September 1895, with his new publication on the way, The Wilde scandal dying down a little, Beardsley felt able to return to London from his self-imposed exile. But his prospects looked altogether more dim. Undeterred, he started writing and illustrating a novel, Under the Hill, a fantasy replete with orgies and bestiality. And he adopted a new, more ornate drawing style, inspired by 18th century French prints. And I rather think that, at the center of the story, he placed himself. In Beardsley's original manuscript, the Abbé Fanfreluche was called the Abbé Aubrey. It's tempting to imagine this as some sort of extravagant self-portrait. What it actually resembles most is a kind of 17th century swagger portrait. This amazing figure almost filling the frame like an effulgent butterfly, with this sensually lipped arrogance, his tiny hand contained in the muffler there. And this aggressively masculine stance is instead replaced by a completely smooth lower portion, as is so often the case with Beardsley's pictures. The central figure is strangely androgynous, rather denatured.
I wonder whether his experience as a man whose prospects for straight life, a straight future in the strictest sense, marriage and children, it's not something you can really expect, even if he wanted it, and there's no sign that he did. There's no sign that he had romantic relationships with anyone of any gender. But I wonder whether being slightly detached from those expectations and being able to defy a lot of the policing of sexuality and gender and masculinity at that time perhaps gave him an opportunity to think about, well, who am I? What am I? Who are my friends? Who are the people I care about? Who cares about me? Do the labels matter to me in the same way that they are a matter of life and death for other people around him?
Beardsley now cultivated a new friendship that may have been an attempt to address both his personal and financial uncertainties. He'd become fascinated by a study of homosexuality, or unisexuality, by a wealthy writer called Marc-André Rafalovich. Beardsley decided to pay him a visit. But was he attracted by Rafalovich's ideas or his money?
When they met, Beardsley explained that he was, as he put it, in a fix, and appealed to Rafalovich for advice. As an art patron with a large private income, the incentives for Beardsley were obvious. Rafalovich began buying his work, showering him with gifts of flowers and books and chocolates. They even adopted pet names, Beardsley signing himself Telemach and addressing Rafalovich as mentor.
Rafalovich was then attempting to reconcile his homosexuality with a growing Catholic belief. Religious motifs began to appear more frequently in Beardsley's work. And he provided this drawing of a hermaphrodite for Rafalovich's latest volume of poems.
It's hard not to read something very calculating in Beardsley's sudden attachment to Rafalovich, both as financial benefactor and spiritual mentor. Was Beardsley playing him, embracing Catholicism merely to ingratiate himself? Perhaps. But I think whether it was tactical or not, this burgeoning friendship reflected a genuine confusion within Beardsley about his sexuality, and also had the very real effect of reawakening a spiritual need within him.
Beardsley's personal torment seems to have reached a peak just before his 24th birthday. In July 1896, he spent 6 weeks here in Epsom at the Spread Eagle Hotel, recovering from yet another severe tuberculosis attack. Yet this was where he also conjured up his last great work, a series of graphic images that, once seen, are very hard to forget.
And here are the resulting drawings.
8 highly explicit illustrations for a privately printed edition of Aristophanes' bawdy comedy Lysistrata, in which women refuse their warring husband's sex until a peace treaty is signed. With these pictures, Beardsley is exhibiting yet another change of style, this time drawing on Greek vase painting, which he'd studied in the British Museum, depicting figures with giant stylized phalluses, as sported by ancient Greek actors. These are amongst the very first of Beardsley's drawings that I ever encountered, which drew me to him like a moth to a flame. I wonder why. They've lost none of their boldness or impact, the very definition of in your face. But there's an added poignancy from sitting here, and that comes from reading the letters that Beardsley wrote at this period, mostly to Smithers and Rafalovich. I read them for the first time only recently and was surprised how frank and unabashed they are. To Smithers, there is licentious banter and smutty asides. A photograph or a model of my prick. How widely spread is the doubt as to my sex? The cause of it, by the way, was not venereal. And here he tries to make light of his illness. The doctor has given me a wondrous medicine which makes my shit black and headache. Ammonia, potassium, belladonna, and chloroform are among its simplest ingredients. But to Rafalovich, he talks piously of priests and saints and confides how really depressed and frightened he is about his condition. Looking at these pictures again and reading his letters, I get a very real sense of Beardsley sitting here alone in this hotel room, wrestling with his art and his faith. Smithers and Rafalovich perched like an angel and a devil on each shoulder, tempting him this way and that, towards the darkness and the light. Over the coming months, the hemorrhages became more frequent and intense, and Beardsley made plans to leave England. "Oh, how tired I am of hearing my lung creak all day," he wrote to Rafalovich, "like a badly made pair of boots." In April 1897, accompanied by his mother, Beardsley set off for the French Riviera. He was bound for Menton, one of its chief health resorts, where he'd taken rooms here at the Hotel Cosmopolitan. The proximity to the mountains and the sea gave him a brief and misleading sense of restored energy. Beardsley began a new project, telling Smithers with typical frankness that the coming year would bring either death or masterpieces. To illustrate Ben Jonson's satirical play, Volpone, Beardsley embarked on a series of decorative initials using pencil and wash. But this tonal work was far more exacting than his line drawings, and the physical exertion took its toll on his frail body. He could only manage 3 to 4 hours a day. One day, near the seafront, an acquaintance noted how he saw, for a second, a yellow skeleton fighting an umbrella on the steps of a chapel, and suddenly recognized it to be Beardsley himself. Now a practicing Catholic, seeking out a place of worship, Beardsley had chanced upon this little chapel, which he began to attend regularly. As death tightened its grip on his lungs, Beardsley clung with ever deeper conviction to his faith and his rosary beads. As he sat here, I can imagine his mind reaching back to those days in Brighton when he first sought out the Church of the Annunciation with its altar window, seeing through it all the possibilities of life. A mere 12 years back, and now a lifetime ago. At the end of January 1898, Beardsley was confined to his bed with persistent bleeding.
Beardsley asked his mother to fetch his drawing materials, but the strain was too much. Ellen returned to find him with his face turned to the wall and his gold-nibbed pen embedded in the floorboards, where he'd thrown it in despair. As the weeks dragged on, Beardsley's sister Mabel came over from England to help keep vigil by his bedside. Beardsley then seemingly scrawled one last note to Leonard Smithers, and it's a desperate final missive. Jesus is our Lord and Judge. Dear friend, I implore you to destroy all copies of Lysistrata and bad drawings. By all that is holy, all obscene drawings. Aubrey Beardsley, in my death agony. Is this, I wonder, a deathbed confession? A penitent wrestling with their conscience, surrendering their art to embrace their faith? Is this Beardsley's attempt to reconcile those two great spheres of his life that he always kept separate? Or was it in fact his mother who wrote the note in an effort to save her son's posthumous reputation? Believing his publisher had agreed to his last wish, Aubrey Beardsley died on the 16th of March, 1898. He was 25.
He never tried to hide his illness. He never denied it. He knew he didn't have long. Therefore, it must be work, work, work.
He's not like illustrators of his own period. He has his own personal language that really does stand the test of time.
He was keen to make sure that people understood what we now call his brand, this idea of what you do and the image you project as being sort of a seamless entity.
You have to recognize his courage and his single-mindedness is of an order that is very rare. He raised the bar as to what was possible in terms of simplicity and purity of line and composition, but also of impurity of subject matter.
I have a confession to make. I have been here once before. But back then, I was a morbid 21-year-old, armed only with an Interrail ticket and a scent of parting, and on something of a pilgrimage. Standing here more than 30 years later, I'm more than ever in awe of this tragic man's genius. Aubrey Beardsley seemed to live several lifetimes in his brief span. Restlessly innovative, propelled by his own sense of romantic doom, playful, prodigious, and perverse, almost to the end. But Beardsley remains more than the poster boy for bedroom decadents. He was a very great artist, and his mastery of line and extraordinary imagination shine still.